You're reviewing this book. I don't know if reviewing is the proper word. You're not really reviewing, you're not really critiquing, you're breaking it down for people. You're deconstructing the dialogue, quite literally. And I was not overly familiar with this book, which is embarrassing as a scientist. I suppose my scientist credentials get taken away for saying that. Um, and so in the past few days, I've really been digging deep and I've been listening to all of your talks about it. And so I want to start there because this book seems to be realistically the epitome of everything I'm interested in science. I love science. I love pulsars. I love black holes. I love that stuff. But I also love communicating it with people, talking to people about it, and also understanding why scientists think and do the things they do. That book is the epitome of all that. So I want to pass that off to you. Why is this book important to you? What made you start delving into this book again in your life?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. Of course, it's one of the most well trodden tales in all of science that Galileo was tortured, imprisoned, hung by the rack or his thumbs or whatever they used to do back then, literally getting medieval on him or post medieval. And it was all for writing this book, right? This poor scientist was tortured merely for espousing beliefs that went counter to the imperialist patriarchy of the time. And it turns out nothing could be further from the truth. And in fact, reading it again as an adult after having tried to get through it as a younger person, but not making it all the way through, but really buckling down to make it all the way through, this time revealed to me more than ever why Galileo is my hero and why he will always be my hero, because he had it all. He had everything that I aspire to and more. His intellect was razor sharp. He was deferent, but he was egotistical. He was humble, and yet he was incredibly impolitic and impertinent. There are all too many of his human foibles that go into it, and you really can't get a sense of it merely by reading the treatments of his work by other people and the hagiography of him, which in some ways is aptly put, is sort of a disservice to getting to know him as a human being, which actually made him much more impressive to me now, especially as a mature scientist. But I think for all scientists, and what really was the obstacle, Brennan, which is so kind of foolish and childish, is that I couldn't find this book on audiobook. And I'm like, this book is printed on this gauzy paper, and it's 587 pages long. And I don't know about you, but I haven't read that many books like that since I became a scientist, that are this long, that aren't textbooks. And even the textbook Jackson's behind me. You plowed through that, I'm sure.
Yes, of course.
That might be 700 pages, but you don't read the whole book. It's not like a novel or something like that. This is unput downable, and in a sense, but I also, the way that I consume information, and you might be similar as a podcaster extraordinaire. Well, by the way, you're one of the people that really inspired me to up my game and to get great guests and to go deep as a human being. In particular, your interview with Ray Weiss is a legacy interview that really inspired me to do an interview with him. And so I want to thank you for that. And I won't tell you that what he said about me at the end, although you might have watched it. He thought I was pretty good. So that's the highest encomium one can get. But anyway, like you, I'm sure, we consume things as we produce things, namely orally, AU, orally, and we speak a lot orally,
Hmm.
OR. And so I looked for the audiobook version of it and found it not. Then I looked for the Kindle version of it so I can read in bed. This thing is heavy, and and I couldn't find it. And in a sense, I'm glad I couldn't, because I ended up taking literally thousands of notes on this. But it inspired me to do something, which is to create the first audiobook ever made of any of Galileo's works. And the hope is, with help from my listeners who have reached out to me, and maybe even you'll get interested in this, we're going to translate all of Galileo's books, none of which are quite as long as this one. I mean, as long as one of all of his books, and some say the most important. We're going to translate that, make audiobooks, make Kindle versions of it, and in so doing, we're going to bring it to a completely different audience, perhaps an illustrated version of it as well, perhaps a course, where we sit around and we talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
because I think these are the kind of conversations that made me want to be a scientist in the first place. And if you, I know you're like me because you, as I said, you inspire me to do new things on my podcast, and everyone should subscribe. I'm going to post it on my channel. So immediately subscribe to Brandon's State of the Universe channel on iTunes. Leave a review for him, as I have. Just a phenomenal superstar, rising star. Although you're pretty high up, you're not reaching your apogee yet, but you're getting there.
Yes, I appreciate that, Brian. Hopefully, by the way, you call me a podcast extraordinaire. Here, I'm using the wrong microphone in the intro, so hopefully it sounds a tiny bit better now. Does it?
No. Well, yeah, it sounds fine. We all make we all make some
Yeah,
limitations in our knowledge. Yeah.
of course. Yeah. Now I will say, like, I have like branded my skull with Ray Weiss and what he said to me after the interview too, because he was a very, very kind. He like spent a couple minutes going over how good of a job and you could just tell he's so like nurturing as an advisor, as a professor, as someone who oversees young researchers. He is unlike many people in this field that I have met, in the way that he recognizes. I'm reading this book right now, complete aside, about leadership. And one of the great things about leadership is the leader needs to be able to take people aside and positively reinforce them. And you can tell that Ray Weiss has like built that into his spirit. So I appreciate that. And it's excellent that I motivated you. I wish you would have motivated me during the pandemic, because you were on fire during the pandemic and I was the opposite. Like every other day, I think I averaged like maybe one episode every 3 weeks during the pandemic, because it was I don't know, sitting in the house is just not great. But back to the Galileo, I think it would be fantastic to do a series where we, not we, maybe you actually do the audiobook, sort of, chapter by chapter, and then at the end of the chapter, or even interspersed throughout the chapters, we break to a group of scientists who, I'd be happy to partake, or if you want to get other people, that's whatever. And then we discuss it, sort of break it down, the actual scientific underlying aspects of it, and also the societal aspects. So things like confirmation bias are so prevalent in this work. Things, like how you take two seemingly, obvious observations in the universe and make it such that one of them has to be wrong. You have to be biased in seeing that some way. For example, two objects falling at the same speed, even though they're different masses. That's not a real phenomenon, right? Or rather, that is a real phenomenon. Forgive me. But people in Galileo's day might have not known very much about air resistance, and so may have literally been tricked into believing that objects with different masses do not fall at the same. You drop a feather and a penny on the moon, you might have a different result than if you drop them in California, for example. And so, no, this is all incredibly important information, and I'd be happy to collaborate with you on this. I think we could find an excellent panel of physicists, science communicators from all across the realm, if you will, and come up with something really cool.
Yeah.
I think we could absolutely come up with something. So yeah, count me in, man. Count me in.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I found that, it's interesting because you get all sorts of reactions. I should say that the thing that prompted me to reread this book was really this appearance that I made on on the book club, which is a production of Prager University, which is definitely a right of the center outlet for information, for short videos and so forth. It's got almost 3 million subscribers and gets about almost 2 billion views a year. I'd already made a Prager University video entitled "What's a Bigger Leap of Faith, God or the Multiverse?" that received about 5 million views so far on different platforms, and with that, there's a lot of kind of attention that comes my way from doing such videos. The one I did recently was about the Galileo's dialogue on two chief world systems. And that's kind of an unusual thing. People think of, oh, he's just a right winger, but he's actually incredibly interested in all different branches of culture. And the point that I wanted to make is that this is a book of culture. This is not just merely a science book. And so as such, it could be discussed with anybody. And actually, it's turned out to be one of their most popular videos in this genre, receiving in under a week over 1.1 million views of a 30-minute video dialogue between me and Michael Knowles, who's another conservative pundit and has become
Yeah.
a friend, and this topic of of whether or not we can have a dialogue. First of all, what does it mean to have a dialogue? What does it mean to be a scientist and have scientific dialogues? And it's just funny to see colleagues and friends, quote unquote Twitter friends. I mean, you and I have never met in real life, but we will someday. I'm confident of it because I want to. But there are people on
Yes.
Twitter I could care less about, and they're, oh, are you really on Prager University? It's here's some
Yeah. I was
some
going to ask you about
stupid
that
ad.
exact thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, we could definitely talk about that. But it's just funny because they never watch it. They just comment
Right.
on, oh, it's supported by oil billionaires, which is not correct factually.
Yeah.
But of course you believe everything on Wikipedia because it's the source of all knowledge. It's the easiest, lowest hanging fruit that someone can consume. So I've lost friends over these things, but I kind of view it as a filter, as a filter. I'm filtering out people that aren't really worth having in my virtual life, and so for that sense, it's good. But also, it's illustrative because it reveals all the biases that my so-called scientific friends have, and even lay people that you should trust. Science, and that science is monolithic, and scientists listen to evidence, and I'd rather have answers that questions that cannot be answered than answers that cannot be questioned, like you religious nuts, like I'm some sort of religious zealot. Anyway, these all kind of conspire to me to be really kind of delicious, and the icing on the cake is that this quarter has been really prolific for me in terms of output, in that I'm featured in this traditional values kind of conservative outlet, namely Prager University, which is has a monotheistic slant, ethical monotheism, and then I'm featured on the cover of Skeptic magazine, which is a far different type of venue, and it all involves these types of biases that scientists are susceptible to, just like every other person out there.
Yeah, no, I think that's excellent, and I don't think that any scientist should ever think like, what are the values of the people that I'm presenting to? So I'm assuming they're not insane. I'm not talking about don't go talk to literal Nazis, maybe, or do. I mean, or do, because today you could use an education too. But you get my point. It's like, that is a weird thing to me, and I struggle with that a lot for the position I'm in, because you are. This is true of academics. I guess, scared of the cancellation that might come. And I'm not scared necessarily. I'm not like, my heart's not racing. I don't think I'm going to be. But, I realize that that's a very real phenomenon now. And so you are in a situation where you can maybe collaborate with PragerU or something like that. But oftentimes I feel a little apprehensive about doing that or posting certain things on Twitter, because I'm not in a situation yet where I am, I guess you'd say, financially, like truly financially independent. The show makes money, that sort of thing, but I really do feel like politics is becoming an important aspect of making a career in academics, and I do see a lot of that, like, apprehension to do stuff like PragerU, and it makes no sense to me, because the entire point of me forming the State of the Universe was that if you look at where science denialism, and I don't really like that term anymore because it's been politicized and weaponized, and that's not the way I mean it, but people who generally are not interested in science is what I mean. You find those people in very rural areas, at least I do, and those are the areas I grew up in. And so I started the State of the Universe with the goal of reaching those people and talking to those people. And if the only platforms you're willing to talk to are far left, like podcasty platforms about science, you're not reaching anyone that isn't already interested in the subject matter, which defeats the entire purpose of even talking about the science. You might as well just not even have a speak. Just don't talk. You just don't do the outreach. So I think we're very similar in that mindset. And so
it does. I mean, you should, I'm not going to advise you that you should, just like torpedo your whole, career, whatever connections you make. By the way, I always say my podcast isn't political, or it's politically neutral. And that's because I'll have people like Ben Shapiro, Dennis Prager, Michael Knowles on, and I'll have, Eric Weinstein. Here's Noam Chomsky. He's on the podcast for a second appearance coming up, hopefully soon. And, have these people on. I don't talk about their political views, some of which I find, odious and unserious and not worthy of discussion. But I am fully interested, and I'll I'll defy anybody who says I can't talk to somebody. And this is the whole notion of cancellation and book burning and so forth. That's really kind of medieval getting on top, except now it's coming mostly from the other side. It used to be the McCarthyists were kind of burning books on the right. And I had on, Dave Rubin and, people like him and other people, who are saying their books are being banned and canceled and their book deals are getting canceled left and right. And, how unscientific is that? How ignorant is that to cancel someone because of ideas? Yes, someone's actively advocating to do public harm. I would never have such a person on. I find that morally reprehensible. I wouldn't use that. But on the other hand, I'm not. People have criticized almost any kind of thing that you can imagine that I've had on. They just disagree with it, or they'll, put up some trolling comments. But I've learned to like defy that notion of not reading comments, because I think it bolsters, if you will, and maybe I'm subject to my own confirmation bias, but it bolsters the idea that people that actually care and are willing to change your opinion. My litmus test is, if I debate you, Brandon, and you're going to convince me of your radical right-wing ideology to follow the guy with the horns to glory and victory, I will listen to you if and only if I feel like you can change my mind. And if I am honest, I have to do an inventory on my soul. In Judaism, it's called counting of the soul. Am I really going to change my mind listening to them, to Brendan, or listening to Ben Shapiro, or listening to Noam Chomsky? And if not, I'm not going to debate those sorts of issues. They're not going to convince me to convert to, Scientology. It's just not going to happen. But, if they want to talk about scientists, that's something I'm willing to listen to. And not all, kind of critiques are equally valid. But, once you get above this certain threshold, they call it the Overton window, where it's like how impermissible on the left is your opinion to somebody who's on the right, for example, and vice versa.
Yeah.
But I find, the only kind of polarization I'm interested in is of the cosmic microwave background, and not necessarily about politics, left or right. So I try to have an equal balance, half and half. But even so, I'm finding it very illustrative to do what makes me feel good. So I always say, like my days are spent far more often on telecons than telescopes. And that's exactly the opposite of what I thought being an astronomer would be like. And so a lot of times I have to talk to people, at different agencies and organizations and logistics and stuff. It's not all looking through at my non-existent stubble, stroking it and looking up at the heavens. It's very mundane. It's looking at, is this concrete and this water chiller going to get paid on this invoice, or are they going to stop deliveries? And it's very mundane. I have to do it. I have to do it. I don't want to do it. I have to do it. It's just like exercise. I have to do it. Sometimes I don't want to do it. But when I talk to people like you, it's because I want to talk to people like you. And that's kind of been my fuel in the past 9 months of what I call pandemic podcasting. And so I look at it and I say, do I want to talk to Bryn? Yeah, hell yes. If it's a hell yes, I'll do it.
Yeah. No, I think that's and I think that's sometimes why I get tired of podcasting, because I do kind of, make sure that certain guests check certain boxes, and it can make it not fun. If you're only talking to people with a very rigid set of ideas, sometimes it cannot be fun. And that's just, I guess, so maybe I should take a note out of your book and branch out and try to get some different.
Look at it like it's an experiment, look at it like you're doing an experiment, and some experiments fail. Most experiments fail. Take it from me, a master
of course
failure.
Yeah.
And just do 100 episodes, do 100 podcasts, find the people, branch out of just pure science, branch out of cosmology.
I know. The weird part about that is, though, the name of the show, right? The State of the Universe. So it's like, it's a damn astronomy show. What am I going to do? I thought about literally making a second show, which was no different than the first show, but it's called The State of the Multiverse. And in that show, I would talk to people outside of astronomy and physics. But even that might be a little too, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't want to, make pronouncements as if I'm an expert. I've grown really rapidly, putting GameStop share price to shame. But I treasure all my listeners. It's actually, what I found is half the work is making the episodes, but really, if you don't do the other half, which is marketing and promoting them, it's really almost like you're not going to get anything done. It's a case where you need 100% of the vectors to be pointing in the same direction, and if you don't, you'll get some traction and you'll get some feedback and maybe you don't care, maybe you don't want advertisers, and that's a sure way to turn a hobby into a hassle. But nevertheless, we all have realities. We have to make ends meet, and we have to make an accounting of our material souls as well as our otherworldly heavenly souls. And so I would keep doing stuff. Yeah, if you want to talk, it doesn't matter what your podcast. No one's gonna say, "Oh, well, you know what, Brendan, your podcast called State of the Universe," which definitely means that you're talking about cosmology. Just as Brian Keating's, is about Into the Impossible, which is who knows what the heck that means. But nevertheless, you cannot break out of it and have Noam Chomsky on or whatever. No, not at all. In fact, what I like about it is, and I found this to be true. I had on David Kirtley, who's the proprietor of the Geek's Guide to the Galaxy podcast, one of my favorite podcasts. He was on my show. I was on his show earlier late last year rather. And, he has on everyone, Paul Krugman to me, to Sean Carroll, to, he's just an amazing guy. But one thing he tries to weave through is he loves to geek out on science fiction. That's his bread and butter, but he uses that as a delivery vector to get into conversations with people like Paul Krugman that he might not ever have access to.
Yeah. So the lesson you're telling me, Brian, in so many words, is I need to stop being a bitch, and I will do that. Okay, I will do that. Well, maybe that's not. Maybe we're not allowed to say that. I don't know. I don't know what's allowed to be said anymore, Brian.
I won't
but
cancel you. Don't worry.
Let's relate your experience. Do you hear this construction outside? I hope it's not too loud. I hope you can't hear it. Good. So let's relate this book to your real life experiences. So I have Losing the Nobel Prize right here.
Yeah.
I was flipping through it again. I think I read it twice now fully. It's a fantastic book. Can't recommend it enough.
Thank you.
And you sent me a couple copies that I've given away to listeners on the Patreon. So there's a plug if you want to be on the Patreon.
Yeah,
so let's relate that experience, because in the book on Two Chief World Systems, it's describe the book quickly. It's Galileo coming up with this dialogue where you pit geocentrism against heliocentrism. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. He calls it, Ptolemaic or peripatetic, but it's exactly right. It's, it's a threefold dialogue between three of Galileo's BFFs. There's Galileo, here's Sagredo, and here's Simplicio. Of course, Galileo is not called Galileo in the book. He's not that arrogant to do something I would do, but he calls the character that best represents his perspective, literally and physically, called Salviati, which kind of means like the savior, the saving one. And then Simplicio is like the moron. Simplicio is like the simpleton. And he puts this three-part dialogue, which is very unusual nowadays, but back then was a little bit more common. And he actually used this format twice in his writing career. He wrote like 15 or 20 books, and I intend to go through and make audio versions of them all as sort of my contribution, my work, what do you call that? My beatitudes or whatever towards the Saint Galileo. And so so it's a dialogue over 4 days, and each day they discuss different aspects that are for and against Aristotelian or Ptolemaic or geocentric cosmology, arguments for it and against it. And in the end, I'm not going to spoil how it actually ends, but it's not at all clear that the arguments put forth by the otherwise brilliant Galileo actually are dispositive in any way towards what the resolution that we now know to be the case is. The sun is not going around the earth, but it is essentially the other way around, although not exactly. It doesn't exactly go around the sun, but that's a side note.
Yes. Yeah. So you talk about this book as being sort of the epitome of popular science books.
Yes.
You're a big fan of the way that the scientific method is broken down in almost a dialogue, as opposed to a bullet point or a rigid set of ways in which you should go about science. And that is a great telling of the human side of science, because in the human side of science, there is no, like, you don't walk into my lab at RIT and see like, okay, we have to make a hypothesis. Okay, after the hypothesis is made, we have to make observations and test blah blah blah. There's no checklist.
That's what I do. That's as soon as I go in, I put on the lab coat first, though. You forgot that.
Yes, of course, and the goggles, and a mask. You better have your mask on. And so that's not how science works. In fact, I often talk about on this show the fact that the scientific method is kind of not even a real thing in the truest sense of From the top down, it's real. From the top down, there's a method of our madness. But if you look at the greatest scientific adventions and inventions of all time, what you find is that the ways in which they were found, it's generally not always a theory was made that theorized a prediction could be made, and then the prediction was true, and then voila, we have something that's accepted by the community. A lot of times this stuff happens very happenstance, very oddly, very out of order. You can look at the CMB, for example, right? The CMB is a great example of there was a prediction made that something like the CMB would exist, but the prediction was wrong, right? The prediction was like 30 Kelvin or something like that. And so and then the people who actually found the CMB weren't even looking for the CMB. So the CMB is a great example of the way science has no true methodology. It has a forward progress, but I think it struggles to have a methodology.
Yeah.
And that book covers that perfectly because it's saying, here's all this information we have. How are we going to get a result out of this wealth of information? And the way in which you get the result, again, is a transitional period, but in no way a methodology. And it really tells the human side of science, I feel.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm actually doing another video, a third video for Prager University, and it's tentatively titled, Scientist Says Don't Trust Scientists. Because in reality, the least likely person to trust a scientist is another scientist. You tell me
Of
something,
course.
Brent. I don't say,
Yeah.
Brendan told me, he's this brilliant guy. He's at this top-notch university. Oh, yeah, okay, fine. Straight to publication. Yeah. So I make the point that scientists don't trust it and don't trust other scientists. And that's not a bad thing, because part of the scientific method, which you are absolutely 100% correct about, there is no such thing as the scientific method. Instead, it's an iterative process that itself is still being updated with a methodology. And but generally speaking, it involves a couple of major points, and those are some sort of observation that alerts somebody to a discrepancy between an understanding that had been reached before by perhaps the scientific method, or maybe not. It's only about 400 years old, and since that time, Bacon and people like Galileo, and then Ibn Haytham and other people 1,000 years ago. But really, to test the hypothesis really requires experimentation, not just pure speculation. So that's what separates the Greeks, the Peripatetics, from the kind of Galileos and the Bacons and so forth, in that they were actually doing experimentation. But even that is not sufficient. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient in the following sense, because a scientist might do a test and say, well, that test, can actually confirm an incorrect hypothesis. Let me give you an example. I talk about this a little bit in Losing the Nobel Prize. You look at the sunset, here in California, and the sun goes down, it gets kind of red. Well, the reason it gets red, you might correctly surmise, is because there are dust particles and aerosols in the atmosphere from forest fires and whatnot. And because of that, the scattering of blue light occurs more readily, and we get more red light transmitted. Well, that's most consistent with a slab approximation, what's called the slab approximation. The atmosphere is a flat slab layered on top of a flat Earth. Well, doesn't that prove that the Earth is a flat object? Yeah, it's much more possible to confirm the flatness of the Earth. And by the way, scientists are not now saying out there that the Earth is flat, but that hypothesis would be bolstered by that observation. Here's another example. Michelson-Morley experiment done at my alma mater, Case Western Reserve University. That showed that the Earth is not moving with respect to the ether. In a certain sense, the Earth is stationary. One might conclude, an early 1900 scientist, the Earth is stationary and is not moving. And of course it is, but only under the incorrect hypothesis of the ether being an active force in the universe. So the point is that you cannot have one simple definition of hypothesis, experiment, or observation. Then in the 1900s, a philosopher of science named Karl Popper developed another kind of augmentation to bolster the scientific method as I just described it, and that involved the opportunity for a theory to be falsified as a criterion for which you should apprise its veracity as a scientific field. And there are problems with that, because in addition to the observation and the experimental testing and deductive and inductive reasoning from the hypothesis to the observations and so on, there was also consensus building that you have to build a consensus. Well, guess what? Back then, and peer review, etc. So who are the peer reviewers for Galileo? Were they just stupid idiot priests and popes who's a freaking moron? No, there were scientists. To this day, Brendan, you know this. There's a Vatican observatory that does amazing work with a 3.6 meter class telescope. Why would they have that if they're these ignoramus and idiots? They're not. They're very smart, and they were smart back then. So guess what? There were scientists building a peer review case against Galileo using evidence that existed back then. So do you trust a scientist? They were scientists. Aristotle was a scientist. He thought he was the first to discover that whales were mammals, not fish. He was the first to come up with the laws of logic that we teach to our children, in high school to this very day. He also thought there were 4 elements, and that our Earth was the center of the universe because it was the heaviest natural place for it to go. So science is provisional. That doesn't mean that if you think the Earth is flat, you're just as smart as somebody who thinks the Earth is a perfect sphere. We know it's not a perfect sphere. And so there are distinctions and refinements, but it's always provisional, and that's a good thing. And I think more people should know that. And that's really the subject of my upcoming video about, we hear this all the time, trust a scientist. Let me ask you, Brennan. I'm going to turn the table. Since this is partially an Into the Impossible podcast, we flipped the script and put the guest on the line. I'm going to ask you my final 3 questions at the end for my Patreon subscribers only. No, I don't really have much of a Patreon. I have a Patreon, but I don't get any money from it except for my mom, who sends me bills. But I want to ask you,
To be fair, my mom's a subscriber to my Patreon too.
That is good.
So yeah,
good.
Mom Club.
Maybe your mom can subscribe to my Patreon.
All right, I'll tell her. I don't think she's gonna after that GameStop fiasco.
Good. I hope she put all the proceeds into AMC. Let me ask you, when people say trust scientists or listen to scientists, what do you think they really mean?
In today's world, you're talking about?
Yeah, Joe Biden or somebody tells us trust scientists.
Yeah. Or so
Mario Cuomo. You're Mario Cuomo. What's his name? Andrew Cuomo. Yeah. Your governor.
So I have a very well developed answer to this, and it might take a while. But if I'm boiling it down, I think it's a political malfeasance. I think it's a political ploy to say trust the science. I think, and I actually think it does a huge disservice to science, because it implies that many of the things that you are supposed to be trusting are finalized in the view of scientists, and I think that is a wholesome lie. So when I think that people say trust the science, I think it's the same as them saying trust anything. Trust me. You shouldn't trust them. You shouldn't trust me. You shouldn't trust really anyone without a well-rounded sense or sense of their history. And if you know anything about the history of science, you know that science does change. It does morph. It does. Now you should trust, like you were saying, you should trust science as an iterative process. You should trust that we are, as a community, trying to get the right answer. Right. But you should not trust if I come up to you, like you were saying, and I say, here's some settled science, you should trust it. I don't think that's true. Right. And I think there's a lot of places where the science is just outright not settled, that people are trying to convince you it is settled. One of the more, I guess, what's the word?
Egregious?
Yeah, I guess egregious, but egregious isn't, I guess, egregious. I don't want to call it egregious because then I'll get murdered. But is the idea that biological men and women are identical in every way. I mean, people will tell you trust the science, trust the science. It's patently absurd that you should trust that science. And the reason it's patently absurd that you should trust that science is because that science is not settled science. They've in essence done what people who deny climate change do, which is they've plucked a very tiny subset of a field, and they're citing them as the field, and it is an overwhelming lie.
When you look at the selectivity of their reporting, or is this replicatable? I mean, can you tell? I mean, I don't want to get too it's super controversial, but I will say, it is possible to look at a genetics of a human being and determine that it is has 2 X chromosomes versus 2 Y chromosomes. That is a scientific fact. It is not possible to look and see if that person is black, African black, American black. It's not possible to say there are no genetic differences. And that's why racism, in addition to being a mendacious, evil, falsehood, is anti-scientific. So racism has no basis to say that, but then to say, as people do often, that because because of the historic sexism and discrimination against marginalized groups, we have to make sure that people who have what's now called gender dysphoria, it used to be called something else, because of that we want to make sure that these people are treated fair. Of course, we all want that. We all want them to be treated fairly.
Yeah.
But we shouldn't say that science is used to do that. And I feel like when you see things like that, I don't know how seriously people will take that. I do see things that worry me nowadays, like we're going to have a computer science search, and the people, it'll be studying anti-black racism. And, that's the goal of it. Like, no one ever hired me and said, you're going to do cosmology research. And I don't even care that it's about anti-black racism. I'm a lifetime member of the National Society of Black Physicists as an honorary member. I speak at their conventions. I'm a huge donor. My personal, whatever meager personal scrimpings I have to their annual meetings. And I love it. I'm an active participant. But to say that I have to study contribution, let's just say of African Americans to cosmology, I think even I would start to question, why am I being hired? Is this scientific? Are you interested in computer science? Are you interested in cosmology? Are you interested in social science? We can debate if that's an actual branch of legitimate science. But to me, this listen to scientists really means obey scientists. And that's the thing I'm worried about. Because if you look back through this history of science, from the Middle Ages, of actually since the scientific method that we just kind of loosely sketched out, you come up with people like Trofim Lysenko, who is the architect of the basic massive famine that killed millions of people in the Ukraine and so forth. You find people like Fritz Haber, who was a Jewish German scientist in the 1900s who came up with the Haber-Bosch process, Fritz Haber, that enabled us to eat breakfast this morning, because it is responsible for the fertilizer process that feeds literally half the food, half the earth is fed by this process. Now, he was a scientist. He won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1918 after developing, advocating, and personally witnessing the utilization of chemical gas warfare that killed 50,000 or so Allied troops in the trenches of Northern Europe in 1915. So he's a scientist. And actually, ironically, macabre irony, many members of his own family were killed by the same Nazi government that came to power afterwards that used the same chemical that his company had invented as a pesticide called Zyklon B. And of course, you can't hold him responsible for that. But you ask, well, he's a scientist. Should we listen? There were 3 other Nobel Prize winners that he recruited to participate in these shock gas troops that the German army put together in World War I to the contravention of the 1908 League of Nations Treaty prohibition against their use, which Germany was a signatory to. So I don't have any faith in scientists' wisdom. After all, science means knowledge. It doesn't mean wisdom.
Right. Yeah, I think that they're like I'm very troubled as well by the leftist party in America, and I don't know if this is happening across the world, of them owning science. I think that's very problematic because you have a party that in the last 10 years has actively pushed anti-GMO legislation, has actively pushed anti-nuclear energy legislation. And so you have a party that you shouldn't trust them when they say, trust us, we're scientists. You shouldn't trust them. You simply shouldn't. And I'm not saying you shouldn't trust them on every issue. I'm like a classical liberal. I am I've recently discovered this. I was listening to a podcast. It was I forget which podcast it was, but I recently discovered this phenomenon where people get out of jail and then sue their public defender. Do you know that this happens?
No.
So this happened. People will get out of jail and sue their public defender for giving them a bad sentence, as opposed to suing the prosecutor. The reason why psychologically is that they don't blame the prosecutor. The prosecutor was doing the job,
Right.
their job. They blame the public defender because the public defender failed at their job. And I equate my feelings to the political left saying trust the science in that exact frame of mind. I do not fault members of the right for being anti-scientific in some of their viewpoints, which I think that on some of their viewpoints I think they are. And I'm talking mainstream sort of right-wingers are anti-scientific in some of their views. I don't blame them for that. I would like to change their mind. I would like to talk to them. I would like to discuss it. I would like to find out where our differences arise. But I don't blame them for that.
Yeah.
As much as I blame the left, who is my public defender, who's failed me, who has convinced society at large that they are the party of science without actually being scientific in a number of ways. So I feel people on Twitter often think I'm like a right-wing nut because of how much I criticize the left. I hate these people sometimes because they're taking what I consider to be the party that should be standing up for people, that should be working to spread science amongst the population, and they are discrediting it all, and it angers me deeply.
Watchdog. They should be the watchdog. They were traditionally in the watchdog. That's what I'm saying. It's been inverted, wherein people had a notion that the right, the McCarthyites and so forth, and even my friend Eric Weinstein, who agrees very wholeheartedly with you, when I ask him, well, where's the danger on the right? He'll point to this, Cook and Coakley thing of 1970. It's like before I was born, let alone before you were born. And that's like the most recent thing on the right. And then on the left, it's just like he just goes off on them because, like, for example, he doesn't get invited anymore. He used to have friends at the New York Times. They did a cover piece on him a couple of years ago on this intellectual dark web, which is comprised almost entirely of people on the left, Sam Harris, him, his brother, Brett, etc. And slowly this became he became persona non grata, and that perpetuated this cycle where now he cannot get invited on left-wing shows, MSNBC and New York Times podcasts, etc., NPR. They won't call him. They don't give him the time of day. And so what's left, if he wants to spread a message which he views as valid, is he gets invitations from Glenn Beck and Ben Shapiro and other sorts of people that are certainly on the right. Now, what does that do? Well, that just gives intellectual fodder for people on the left to say, see, you only go on these right-wing crackpots show. So it's this perpetuating cycle of, again, what is it? Confirmation bias. And so, you and I were talking before the show about, like, is confirmation bias alive and well? I talk about it a lot in Losing the Nobel Prize, how it afflicted me personally. And I think it's having, one of the takeaways from my year of pandemic podcasting and talking to so many eminent people, including 8 Nobel Prize winners, is this notion of groupthink and how powerful it is, and how scientific stories might be going untold because they might violate a narrative which is believed to be preferable, natural, unique, etc. And I actually, it's funny because even in my non-political life, in my scientific life, I get criticized for being too much in the inflation camp or too much in the opposition to inflation, which is the core science that I'm trying to do. And it can be frustrating because I'm definitely trying to keep an open mind. And by doing so, again, as I do politically, it's not that I'm not political and I'm some, milk white, kind of bland, flavorless person. I achieve neutrality by wild excursions to the left and the right, politically, from Noam Chomsky to Ben Shapiro, and from people like, Sir Roger Penrose and Paul Steinhardt on the left, I don't know, scientifically, to people like John Preskill and Frank Wilczek and others on the other side that are, conventional kind of scientific thinkers that in terms of the narrative that dominates cosmology now, Kamran Vafa and Ewan Dana, that inflation took place, that string theory is a valid paradigm to approach the fundamental unification of forces. So I achieve neutrality, but I never give either side, a free pass. And I criticize both of them legitimately, I believe, for some of the blind spots that they may have. And I think that's what makes it unique. You have to, you take a stand. You're not just like this bland, kind of tell me why you're so great and why you're so brilliant. That's not the way I want to conduct my particular interviews or conduct my scientific research. And I think, Galileo felt that. Again, I'm comparing myself 100% to Galileo. But no.
Well, I think your books have incredible similarities in the way that you break down the human flaws in doing this science on the big stage. So I think that that's a fair comparison in many ways.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I feel like, I don't feel like I approach what he has done, but I do want to point out that, some of the greatness of Galileo, again, stems from his ultimate humanity and his knowledge of human nature. But again, there he had huge blind spots as well. He had this, this concept that, that he could say whatever he wanted to, because of, something that the Pope said in passing before he was Pope. And that he could put the words of the Catholic Church in the mouth of a simpleton that everybody knew he was talking about. From those perspectives, I think, he was very, very naive, maybe intentionally so. And nowadays, I think we have people like that as well. But what was so delightful for me is that he would look at questions that we wrestle with to this day. For example, we think about what's known in psychology as like denial of death. So I found this amazing passage that really spoke to me. And he goes, I found the deeper I go, considering the vanities of popular reasoning, the lighter and more foolish I find them. This is in the dialogue. This is a book about like the orbit of the Earth, the origin of the Earth's tides. You're like, what the heck? And he's talking about death and how people are naive. What greater stupidity can be imagined than by calling jewels silver and gold precious and earth and soil base? People who do this ought to remember that if there were as great a scarcity of soil as of jewels or precious metals, there would not be a prince who would not spend a bushel of diamonds and rubies and a cartload of gold just to have enough of earth and soil to plant a jasmine in a little pot, or to sow an orange seed and watch it sprout, grow, and produce handsome leaves, fragrant flowers, and fine fruit. This is not like, some boring, dry, bland scientist. This is a man of erudition, a Renaissance man in the truest sense. And I aspire, as I say, I can't write as beautiful as him, but he another passage, if you'll indulge me, Brendan, he presages what we now call the Dunning-Kruger effect, which, as you know, is something like the less you know of something, the more you think you're an expert.
Of course.
And he says,
we all learned that the hard way in this field.
Yeah. And he goes like this. He says, the vain presumption of understanding everything can have no basis other than never understanding anything. For anyone who had experienced just once the perfect understanding of one single thing and had truly tasted how knowledge is accomplished, he would recognize that of the infinity of other truths, he knows nothing. And this is just a mesmerizing account of things that took hundreds of years for social scientists to come up with. But the last thing I'll say is towards the end, he says, just as an illustration of how amazing a writer he was, he said, I do not presume to be able to adduce all the proper and sufficient causes of those effects which are new to me and which, consequently, I have had no chance to think about. What I'm about to say, I propose merely as a key to open portals to a road never before trodden by anyone, in a firm hope that minds more acute than mine will broaden this road and penetrate further along it than I have done in my first revealing of it. So this is like, you can see there's a little bit of sarcasm, there's a little bit of hubris, there's a little bit of kind of ego, and then there's a little bit of humility. And how amazing is that? To have this book that speaks to me across the millennia, almost half a millennia. There's no question it's my favorite book of science, including my own book.
Yeah, and it speaks, I don't want to hold you too long, Brian.
I have another 20 minutes. I could go.
Okay. Yeah, so one of the incredible things about the fact that it speaks to you across millennia is that it represents a scientific method. And the great thing about the scientific method, and the reason it shouldn't be trampled upon by politicians or by scientists or by people with agendas of any form, is that as long as the scientific remains the iterative, holy process that it is, it will continue to inspire people millennia from now. And it is not to be toiled with. It is because at the end of the day, the scientific method is as much human nature as being hungry. I mean, the scientific method was how we found food. The scientific method was how we found clean water. The scientific method was how we found clothes.
Yeah, and
And the
nowadays, how
scientific
we come to decision about consensus about climate change, I mean, and
Yes.
vaccines being safe, and et cetera. But
Yes.
my problem is that the more you tell people that things are subjective, that you can choose, you can do everything you want, and of course we can choose, but you can't say scientifically that I don't believe a virus is causing this particular malady that's afflicting whose name we cannot mention. We
Mhm.
can't say that it's a ghost or it's a spirit. But the same token is, the people that will say on one day, they'll say, don't wear masks. And they do it for completely legitimate reasons. I mean, they did the same thing with secondhand smoke when you were a little baby, probably. You don't remember this, but they say secondhand smoke kills, 50,000 people a year. They just ended up making it up in a certain sense because they felt that the outcome was more important, that
Mhm.
we got people to stop smoking. And nowadays you get like
Yes.
way more videos and commercials, at least in California. I don't remember in New York where I grew up, but about the evils of smoking and nothing, absolutely nothing about the evils of drinking. Now, I'm not going to advocate people should go out and smoke 6 packs a day like my friend and mentor Jim Simon does for the last 60 years. But nevertheless, I will say that from the perspective of, what is scientifically true, how many people like beat up their wives and their kids, after having a pack of cigarettes versus a 6 pack? I mean, there's no
Yeah.
So when people say that, or here's another one of my favorite ones. I'm a pilot. So what's the first thing you do when you get on a plane, on an airliner? They say, shut off your phone, put it in airline mode, right?
Yeah.
So do you think that, first of all, do you think everybody complies with that, Brennan, that rule?
Oh, absolutely. I think I'm guilty of not doing it
Yeah, right.
sometimes.
So, and how many plane crashes have you survived so far?
I've survived 3 actually.
You've been in 3
3.
plane crashes in
No,
commercial?
I'm
Yeah,
not,
okay, fine.
I'm
All
kidding, of
right, fine.
course. Yes.
Okay, so yeah, so none, right? So the odds, and I'll tell you as a pilot, that the possibility, the probability, the odds of getting killed in such a plane crash, caused by someone's inerrant use of a cell phone not in airplane mode, are basically microscopic, infinitesimal.
Yeah.
And I'm not
Mhm.
giving advice, whatever. I always comply with it
Yeah.
myself and on my own airplanes when I do fly my own planes on those occasions. However, the fact is that there's a reason they do it. It has nothing to do with the scientific cause and effect of crashing planes, and that's because
Mhm.
it's a way of establishing sort of authority of the commander of the plane, the pilots themselves,
Yeah.
and the flight attendants. They need to have an authority to tell you to sit down, put on your seatbelt, so that you'll listen to them when the plane is going down because it ingested a flock of birds on each side of its wings. And so for that reason, they view it as, well, we're going to say something kind of scientific, but it's really mostly theatrical and psychological so that we will have control when we really need it. I feel like it's almost the opposite. Like the more you tell people things that aren't true in the name of science, it may
Mhm.
redound to a negative effect when science is really necessary, like curing a disease, combating climate change, et cetera, et cetera. And so
Yeah.
I'm wary of saying listen to scientists when it means obey scientists.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I do think that is I think that does drive a lot of science denial when you tell people, listen to the science, listen to the science, listen to the science. And then you have people saying, but wait a minute, the science doesn't really make all that sense. Like, why are we enforcing lockdowns, for example? The ordinary person, even if lockdowns are the better option than staying open, even if that's true, you need to have public health officials and scientists at the ready, willing to answer the questions that ordinary citizens have truthfully. These are not conspiracy theorists. My mom asking me why she's not allowed to go to work is not a conspiracy theorist.
Right.
She's a concerned citizen.
Yeah.
And our job as scientists is to communicate the reasons for her not to be concerned, or the risk that you're taking, or that sort of thing. The other day I had discovered this great thing that's on the weather.gov.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't get snow where you live, but I get tons of snow where I live.
Actually, in the eastern part of San Diego, we get a lot of snow.
Oh, do you really?
Yeah, there are mountains that are 7,000-8,000 feet high. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
not
as much as
San Diego
Rochester.
proper.
Yeah, surely
not San Diego.
Not
yeah.
Rochester.
Yeah, so we get a ton of snow, and I found this great model on weather.gov where
Mhm.
you can click through the different amounts, and it will tell you the percentage chance of you getting that amount of snow. In other words, out of all of the models we run, 60% of the models indicate you will get more than 4 inches. And I was saying to my wife, I don't know why we don't communicate this to people on meteorological channels, because this is a great way for my brain to picture it. It's like, okay, so out of 100 models that were run, 60 of them gave us more than 4 inches of snow, 40 of them did not. So then my scientific mind works really well in that. It's like, oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense. So,
Yeah.
But she kind of illuminated to me, maybe this is my confirmation bias, that ordinary people are just not taught to think like that. Like that does not illuminate for her anything else. She would rather the Weather Channel just give her a number.
Right.
And so it is a tough job nonetheless. My point is to communicate accurate science to people.
But
The
yeah.
complexities that don't get communicated end up leading to doubt. You see it in meteorology, and you see it in climate, and you see it in diseases. You see it everywhere. But I think it is a net negative to openly communicate lies or deception because you think it is for the greater good. It is never for the greater good.
Yeah.
I believe it is never for the greater good.
I agree. I think it comes back to haunt scientists as well when they're used as
Yes.
political pawns. I make the point in this upcoming Prager University video that if you every 4 years we get told why by 70 Nobel laureates, 50 Nobel laureates, whatever, which one of the Democrats we should vote for. It's never been a Republican in my whole life, and I'm wondering, well, is that because Republicans were so anti-scientific? I mean, you're kind of mentioning, well, they're not really the party. I don't know if that's actually true, but let's just say it's true. So we get told who we should vote for by all these Nobel laureates, or they'll sign a petition. We should be in the Paris Accords and we should be in the Iran Treaty or whatever.
Yeah.
They get political, and we're supposed to listen to them because of what is called the halo effect, which is another form of anti-scientific bias. Einstein was brilliant. He was, he came up with theory of relativity in 2 different forms. He understood the photoelectric effect, Brownian motion, et cetera, et cetera. You know all this. He also didn't believe in the uncertainty principle, basically. Didn't believe in what's called action at a distance. He didn't believe the universe was expanding. And yet, despite all this, he was asked to be the 2nd president of the state of Israel. He was asked to testify about certain, the morality of using the atomic bomb, et cetera, et cetera. And I point out again, like I did with Fritz Haber, Fritz knew a lot about the chemical structure of nitrogen fixation. He didn't know about the moral implications, and he died after his wife and I believe 2 of his kids committed suicide. Some say because of the guilt they harbored from their relationship with their father and or husband. And his insistence that it was actually okay to use chemical weapons, even though Germany had signed a treaty vowing to it. So, and my point is, look at like William Shockley. Like, guy was brilliant. He co-invented the transistor. He won the Nobel Prize. He believed that African Americans are inferior to whites. Explicitly said it, and they should be encouraged using economic means to become biologically sterilized. I mean, can you imagine a more horrific thing to say about another human being, which I believe is created in the image of God or whatever, has infinite worth beyond anything else, any human being? I don't care what your color, race, creed, orientation, identification, whatever. Okay, so should we listen to him? He's a scientist. In fact, he was so committed to this idea that he was the only known contributor, depositor in what was called the Nobel Prize sperm bank. It was called the Genius Factory. It was actually in northern San Diego County, where I am now. He actually confirmed that he did because he wanted his genes to proliferate so as to accrue to the benefit of all mankind, as Alfred Nobel put in his will. So I think we have to be very careful. Nowadays, James Watson openly says things about women that are horrific, sexist, disgusting. Some say he does that just to get attention and because he knows he's not cancelable. But yet we never retract these Nobel Prizes. We never take away this esteem, the highest esteem, as I write, the goldenest, the most shiny of all golden calves in society is the Nobel Prize. So much so that they get asked to opine on who you should vote for. So now let me ask you, if you're going to outsource your political decisions to these scientists, sometimes you're going to get people that tell you have to listen to the Shockleys and the Habers and the Watsons of the world. And I think that's inherently dangerous. And I think it's a sign of cowardice by politicians to say, we're going to just do what the scientists tell us to do. No, I didn't elect Fauci. He's not the president. You should take advice from him. And then you should wait, President Biden, you're my president. We elected you. And the point is, you're not allowed to outsource this decision so that you could later say, well, we did what science told. No, you have to make judgments. You have to make wisdom-based judgments. That's what we elected you. Don't outsource it to unelected people, or else you could get rule by the scientists, just as Galileo and others experienced. It's a very perilous pursuit.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 1,000,000%. And I'll say, to go back to the weather analogy, we can kind of end with this concept. If the Weather Channel told you that we were going to get 18 inches of snow every time it snowed because they didn't want you out getting in a car crash, even though we were only going to get 2 inches of snow, I think after a single month you would not trust them anymore.
Right.
And that is what we don't want to happen with the scientific endeavor in general. When I saw publications like Nature, publications like Scientific American endorsing Joe Biden as president, I was livid with this enterprise that I am a part of, because this science does not endorse anyone. Right. Science is not an endorsable or something that can be endorse or endorse somebody else.
It's not political.
Science, yes, it is not political. And in making it political, you do what every other institution in this country has done, which is overly politicize every decision and make everyone on the other side distrust you. So I'm not hopeful at all. I think science is going to reach, and I've said this vocally over the past few months, I think science is going to reach an epitome of distrust in the coming years during the Biden administration. And I think that that's not going to be Joe Biden's fault. It's not going to be Fauci's fault. It's going to be the way that average Americans blame science when bad decisions are made. Yeah. When pipelines are canceled and people lose their jobs, people are going to say that was a scientific decision. Those scientists must be stupid and distrust the entire endeavor. And I will like to walk back something I said. I don't think that in general the right is anti-science. I don't mean to say that. I think the right is anti many things. I don't think they're anti-science. I don't think they're overly sexist. I don't think they're racist. I don't think they're any of those things. I think that they look at sort of scientific advancement in a much more calculated, nuanced way than maybe people on the left do. I think that they say, well, let's use a pipeline, something they might favor, instead of driving stuff by train, because guess what? We're not going to stop using gas tomorrow. Yep. Oil's not going away.
And so this are more dangerous, right?
Yes. So I think that they're I don't mean to say that they're anti-science, and I wish I wouldn't have said that, but I'll walk that back now.
Right, that's fine.
So
we'll retract that. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that there shouldn't be like science is political. In fact, my joke used to be, I like being an astronomer because no one looks up and says, oh, I hate that Republican asteroid and I love that Democratic comet. It doesn't make any sense. It should be apolitical. And in fact, for the benefit of, we always say that religion should be kept out of education. I believe that, even though I might educate my children according to my Jewish faith. On the other hand, we never say, we say it's good for religion for us to have a secular government. I could not agree more strongly. I think it's the best form of government is to have have a secular government. However, why isn't that not also equally good for science and the arts to have it be apolitical? Why do we have, politicians, toilets that are in the art world, that are called America that you relieve yourself on for a fee? This is considered high art. Why is art politicized? Why is science politicized? It's bad for art. It's bad for science, just in the same way that education and government are bad when they incorporate religion and gods and so forth. So I do think that, we should have separation of scientist and state, not that that we shouldn't have. I'm all for actually one of my, the widow of my advisor in graduate school, Frances Arnold. She was married to Andrew Lang, who is my advisor, committed suicide, as I mentioned in my book. Very tragic event, and not the least of whom was affected was me, but his family, his children, etc., and the whole world. But she's now serving in the office of scientific advisors. It may be true that Biden is much more open to scientific advice. I hope that you're wrong, that it will be viewed as ushering in a new dark age, so to speak, where people distrust science. But I can't really argue at this moment when people are really thinking that science is this magical capability to know the answers. And the problem is that scientists are cultivating that image. When I hear something like, oh, Professor Keating, I'm no Einstein, I'm not smart, some kid, or like, I'll never be like that. I had Jim Gates on, who's the Ford Foundation professor at Brown University, a friend of mine, father of supersymmetry theory. And he said Einstein wasn't always Einstein. It's like we do science a disservice when we say, oh, it's only capable to be done by these very specialized people with specialized equipment that have access to specialized knowledge that you may not have access to, Mrs. Drackler and whatever. And so I think it does science a disservice. It excludes other minds, from around the world who might not feel like they can do this because, oh, look at these scientists, they're never wrong. They always get things right, especially when they predict about the future. And nothing, as we know, as professional scientists, could be further from the truth. I wonder, Brendan, if you have time to go into the impossible with me, my signature.
Yes, I do.
3 questions.
And
yes.
Yeah. Before we jump into the impossible, one final comment that I think can really leave this state of the universe on a great show, or on a great note, which is that the fact that the left is willing to take ownership of science, and the fact that the right is willing to try to fight that movement, implies that both political sides really do revere science and hold it to a high regard, which is, if we want to find a diamond in the rough, that's the diamond to find. That science is.
But they should listen to each other. It shouldn't be like, when I won this presidential award for a young scientist, and I received it from George W. Bush. And I remember a lot of my friends were like, "You're going to talk to that war criminal? He's scum. He's scumbag. Right, far right. Blah 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 blah." And they were just going off and defriending me, deplatforming, whatever back then. I was just like, all right,
what do you do back then? You just don't talk to someone anymore?
I was just like, all right,
take them off
it's not like I'm hurting for people to talk to that are really brilliant people and that I enjoy talking. Remember, my first Keating's filter, Keating's razor is, am I gonna have fun with this particular chunk of 30 minutes to 90 minutes, whatever. So just cut them off. Sorry, you lose. I don't really care. And that goes for anybody. If Noam Chomsky's not going to come on the show, or if, Cenk Uyghur or some guy in the left, they're not going to, all right, good. You lost out on talking to and having a good conversation that is about the best of us, about the best of the human mind is when we explore its outermost boundaries. But and then it was just funny to me to then see, 15 years later, my friends saying, oh, Trump, why can't he be more like George Bush? Like the same people who were like canceling me back then. Oh, like George Bush, he goes to baseball games with Ellen DeGeneres, and like look at her, Michelle Obama hugging him.
It really was hilarious to see, because I recognize that too. I remember George Bush being this hated, vilified character, and now he's looked back upon as this like
and
nice old
Brandon,
man
with the benefit of CPT invariance. So what can you predict 100% to be the case? Just based on this example that we just gave. And you can add in Mitt Romney. Remember, like, all the awful things he was going to do and treat. But now he's like a hero of the Democratic Party as far as Republicans are concerned. So what can we now say?
I think this is a tough. This is a bold prediction.
Okay.
But I think, can we say that Donald Trump will be revered in a few years?
Yes, exactly.
Yes. In like 10 years, everyone will look back on this moment.
And everyone's listening to say, screaming at us, you idiots. He's worse than Hitler, as Spike Lee just called him recently. It's just like, okay, all right, well, we'll see what happens. Good luck.
Yeah.
All right, let's go into the impossible, because I got to get back to the lab and meet with my grad students. I'm having so much fun with you. But I want to make sure that we get to these final questions here on the Into the Impossible podcast. So as you know from reading the book, Alfred Nobel endowed this golden medallion, and he said it must go to the single person. We're not going to get into that, as I discussed in the book, but who had the greatest benefit to mankind through he meant back then, but his or her nowadays, of course. Luckily so, we have many women winning it, although only 2 of whom are alive today, in physics at least. But anyway, getting back to it, he said that their discoveries or inventions must benefit all of mankind. And now they changed that to humankind, thankfully. But I want to ask you, that's what's known as an ethical will. When you give not only monetary goods and services, but you give away ethical wisdom to future generations. And I want to ask you, as a young person, when you reach the biblical age of 120 and spring forth this mortal coil, what one piece of wisdom would you most want to leave for the future?
What one piece of wisdom would I think it's so cliche, but it's real. Like, okay, I had Duncan Lorimer on my show once, and he had used this phrase, "Youth is wasted on the young."
Mm-hmm.
And I constantly go back to this phrase in my mind. This is a great phrase, and to really probe it. And I think that as you get old, you really start older. You really start to pursue the things in life that you find most important, and you begin to sort of get out of the shell that you trap yourself in, which we talked about at the beginning of our recording together, which is that I kind of put up these barriers in my own world of growth in the podcast, right? We are a top. Do have a top 10 astronomy physics show on the planet, but I could have so much more if I could break down those barriers and just be who I want to be or who I think I am. So I think that's the piece of wisdom I would sort of leave behind in everything, in science, in life, in all of it, is that you have to pursue you. You have to fundamentally understand who you are. And I think we all have a great barometer for that. We all have a great barometer for what we like to do, what we like to be, barring any like mental illness or depressive states, which we all suffer from. We do all have great barometers for who we should be. And oftentimes we don't have the will or the ability or the sort of confidence in ourselves to pursue who we should be being. And so that would be the piece of wisdom I would leave behind is, if you're a scientist, pursue the science you want to pursue with all of your might. Pursue it, pursue it, pursue it. If you have an idea, chase it. In life, in entertainment, no matter what it is, identify the things that get you up in the morning and tackle them. Like tackle them as if nothing else matters on the planet.
Fantastic.
So I guess that's the wisdom I'd leave.
Awesome. Well, as you know, I'm the associate co-director, I always forget my title, of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination at the University of California, San Diego. I'm the proprietor of the Into the Impossible podcast, so please tune into that if you're listening on Brendan's channel, and then please tune into State of the Universe on iTunes as well. We are always duking it out for top 10 status in this domain. And as I said, I've learned so much and been inspired by the passion, the intense, relentless curiosity of mind that Brendan exhibits and exhilarates. Okay, question number 2. What piece of knowledge would you put on your monolith? If you've seen the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, these monoliths feature prominently therein. These are time capsules left by an ancient alien civilization to serve as a warning, as a talisman, or perhaps just as a time capsule for future generations. And it's not unlike Richard Feynman had the so-called cataclysm question, which went as follows. If in some cataclysm all of scientific knowledge were to be destroyed and only one sentence passed on to the next generation of creatures, what statement would convey the most information in a single sentence? And then he gives his answer to that. But he's not on the podcast right now. I'm trying to get him on the podcast via GPT-3, synthesized synthetic Feynman, AInman, but we'll see if that ever happens. But anyway, Brandon, what is your kind of statement or knowledge or phrase that you'd put on a billion-year lasting time capsule?
That is an excellent question. And I don't know, what phrase would I put on a time capsule if I was sending it off? See, this kind of makes me just like kind of want to copyright or rather plagiarize Carl Sagan's Voyager decisions.
That's fine. I actually had his widow, Andurian, on the show, and she said, yeah, I did that on the golden disc.
Yeah. So
you plagiarize, that's fine.
But I don't know. Maybe
you're an academic. You're supposed to plagiarize.
Maybe for the sake of how about it? Maybe for the sake of the episode we just did, I think things are not as you perceive them to be. Maybe that would be an excellent way to inspire the future generation to come up with their own science. And here's why I wouldn't want to put anything too scientific, because if we could imagine that the next civilization is not quite like us, there's no guarantee that they come up with the same science we did. There's no guarantee they come up with general relativity. It's possible they come up with an equally valid theory of gravity that is not general relativity, because general relativity is likely not the final domino at the end of the gravity well, if you will. There's more to be found. There's always more to be found. And the question is that the only mathematical description you can come up with to describe space-time as we know it? The answer might be no. So I think for the sake of this fake simulation that we're talking about, I think I would warn them about confirmation bias, and I would let them run amok and allow them to pursue the science that they can find for themselves.
Very good. That is excellent.
What would you do, Brian? I know this is a questions for me, but did you have an answer for that one?
Oh, for that one, yeah. So I would put more of a moral or ethical implication on such an object, but specifically for scientific knowledge, I would say that the most scientific information that could be contained would be something like the structures of galaxies, stars, planets, and organisms are predicated on the existence of atoms, which were themselves forged in either fiery supernova cauldrons or within the first 3 minutes of cosmic existence. And what came before that may forever be firewalled off from our vision and our notion and so forth. But in the second sentence, because I can do it because it's my show, at least this section is, as I would say that we should never let our curiosity really be exceeded or fail to live up to what our imagination is capable of. The last question in the thrilling 3 questions that we ask all of our esteemed guests and who honor us by their presence is going backwards in time. So we went 1 billion years in the future, the time capsule you just answered. We went into the future when you're 120. Now I want to go backwards to add advice to your former self. How old are you now?
I am 25.
25. Wow. Half my age. That's phenomenal. I want to ask you, I normally say, what advice would you give to a 30-year-old? That's not going to work. But I want to ask you, what advice would you give to a 20-year-old Brendan Dreckler that enable you to do what the title of this podcast, my podcast at least, is, which is the Into the Impossible podcast, which derives from Arthur C. Clarke's third law, which is the only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. Name of this podcast. I want to ask you, what would you advise your former self, maybe at 15, let's go 12 and a half. Let's go half your age. What would you advise a young Brendan to do in order to develop the courage as you have to go into the impossible?
If I was 15, or if I was advising my 15, well, first I'd tell myself to get off the opioids, which I wouldn't have done for another year or two. But I would tell myself that, and then
is that real? Are you being honest?
Yeah. So I have. Well, this is your Patreon, so I talk about it on the show from time to time. Mm-hmm. I was a drug addict from a very young age. I started doing drugs when I was 12. Wow. And I didn't get truly clean until I was 16 or 17. So. So what I would do is tell my 15-year-old self, pursue science, because I did not start the journey to become an astrophysicist until I was 18, a senior in high school at 18, because I had failed some high school grades because I just didn't go. I didn't care about school. I was too busy wrapped up in my life of nefarious drug doing.
That I knew, but I didn't know that was because of an addiction issue.
Yes. So
what was the thing that kind of got you out of it? Was it a 12-step program? Was it like friends and family? How did you overcome? I mean, that's like I say it to my wife all the time. We're blessed to have children. And I say to her all the time, I'm like, the one thing I pray, to the extent that I believe prayer can actually do anything, but the one thing I do is that they will be free from addictions of all kinds. It could be social media addiction. It could be, pornography, whatever. Yeah. Food. I've had a tremendous challenge with food. I've gained and lost 50 pounds many times in my life, and I'm currently trying to lose it. I suffer from that, kind of addiction. Now, we don't in society typically think of it as in the same kind of class as, as some awful thing. And I'm not saying that drug addiction or substance abuse is, but I do pray for that. And my wife and I agree on that. And it's the one thing that makes your child lose his or her free will, I believe, and therefore not be your child anymore. And I've had conversations with the most esteemed theologians and secularists, and I think all agree. But I'm curious, Brenda, how did you overcome it? Was there? I mean, obviously it's not a hack and do these crazy simple tricks and there's a loophole and you'll get how did you overcome it? That's a tremendous accomplishment.
I think it was something you had mentioned, which is that you lose your free will. I think I started to realize that. I think I started to realize I'm losing my free. I looked around me and I saw all these people who were in the same position as me, and I saw that this small coal region town in Pennsylvania with nothing to offer anyone is a proverbial black hole, and the only way to get out of the black hole is to climb against the tide very hard. And a ton of credit to my now wife, who was an addict with me at the time, and we just decided that we don't want to live it. Well, two things. I don't want to put my kids in a situation that I was in.
Yeah.
Which is why I have not had kids yet, with my wife of many years now. I don't want to put them in a situation where they have to worry about any of that stuff. And so I think it was just like that situation, as I just realized I'm on an amazing planet in an amazing universe. I was always interested in astronomy. I would get high and stare at the stars, in my opioid-riddled life. And I just realized that this isn't where free will exists, and I need to pursue something that I'm passionate about. And I went back to school in the 10th grade. And after I hadn't really been in an institution for 2 years, I mean, I was there, but I wasn't there. I was expelled. I was, all this stuff. So go back to school, get the education, go to college. I'm going to pursue this astrophysics thing. And, my wife was there with me. We went to the same college together. We did it all together. So I think it was just that. It's like I wanted free will. And I think maybe I was blessed with the fact that maybe I think more deeply about some of these questions than other people. And I don't mean to say that in a way that's like derogatory towards anyone else. I don't think I'm smarter than anyone else, but I was always perplexed with these questions about, and I think just people who are predisposed to do astrophysics are, like we had talked about on my show about you before, like maybe the last recording, is your interest in cosmology stems from a very deep place. It's not something you just wake up when you're 16 and want to do. There's some underlying reasons why you want to know about the beginning of the universe. And I think that there were some underlying reasons why I wanted to too. And I was blessed with having that outlet. Yeah. And I think many people aren't blessed with having that outlet. I think many people are confused with what they want to do, and drugs make it easy to be in that situation. So
I think, you're kind of, saved by the stars in a certain sense. And it always rankles me when people like, Sam Harris or Tim Ferriss or whatever kind of dabble in this, because I think it's a very slippery slope. I kind of err on the other side, and you could say that that's child abuse or whatever, but basically trying to connote to my kids that it's a zero strikes policy. Like, you try opioids, not just like, I didn't, I tried Diet Coke, I didn't really care for it, I like Diet Pepsi. No, it's not like that. And so it kind of make it a 4-letter word, just like, you're never going to try this. And here are the reasons why. But the people say, oh, you can kind of dance around it. Like, it's true with food, and I always use this as an excuse. And I'm sure Jocko Willink would kind of kick my ass for saying it. But it's like food you have to eat. You have to eat a certain amount of food every day. Mm-hmm. And so the issue for me is controlling portion, or what kinds of macronutrient, whatever. But you don't have to do opioids. Like, that's not part of like everyday life unless you're in excruciating pain. So I do think it is a very slippery slope. I do believe that you lose free will, and people like Sam Harris and others that kind of not glorify it, because I know he's definitely pulled back a lot on it. But as a tool, I do worry about that, the effects that might have. And I'm not making judgments about that mm-hmm. specific use. And I know that painkillers are lifesavers for many people. So but it's not just a question of, well, like, let's recreationally do it. I have friends who do companies that have to do with, kind of like raves, these parties and stuff. Mm-hmm. Like, most of their customers are like on drugs while they're doing it. And I'm like, well, this, but like, you're kind of like feeding off it, maybe taking advantage of it. How is that morally, ethically okay? And it's usually like, well, everyone's got free will to take drugs, but I'm like, not once they start taking it. Oftentimes you don't. And if mm-hmm. I can get addicted to eating, how much more so can someone get addicted to things that could be permanently, maybe irreversibly harmful in some cases. I don't claim to be an expert on this, but I do want to point out one last thing. in relation to this, that my friend and upcoming guest and past guest, Dr. Judson Brewer at Brown University, my alma mater for grad school, he's coming back on the show. He wrote a book called The Craving Mind, and it's about overcoming addictions to things like eating and smoking. And you know what he says is the most potent tool for overcoming at least those addictions. I'm not claiming it would work for opioid addiction, but I'm just curious. I was curious about it, and the word is curiosity, and that the human brain releases a little bit of dopamine when it acquires new information or new hypotheses. And I wonder with you that you recognize maybe you're losing a little bit of that imagination, that creativity that only a few of us, really get to use for a little bit of our time as scientists until we get older and no longer can process the same way we can. But I wonder if the curiosity that is intrinsic to you is that feature of you that allowed you to break out and, as I say, go into the impossible.
Yeah, it might very well be. And I like it's funny because everything in my life prepared me for the life I live now, including the opioids, including the addictions, including the drugs of all forms. Because when you would be around these people and you'd be doing various psychedelics, you'd be smoking weed, you'd be doing, pills, whatever you're doing, the conversations that you get in are actually incredibly deep. Most addicts know that they have a problem. Most addicts know that they're addicted. And most addicts are incredibly curious people. I just think people are actually in general. And if you spend your time with addicts, you'll find that. And so you have these incredibly, incredibly deep, curious conversations. And I don't know why. So my point is, I don't know why it would have propelled me out of the situation and not others. And I'm not doubting that that's what did it. I think that's exactly what did it. But I'm just curious why it doesn't do it for more people.
Yeah.
And then I will say, if I could give my older self advice and by proxy give you advice for your children, I would say that the way you talked about food, where you need food to survive, I think many addicts look at heroin that same way, where they say they do need the heroin to survive because they're not filling their stomach, they're filling a void that exists in their life. Yeah. And if you don't instill that void into your children, I think you won't have a problem with them being hungry for heroin or any vice for that matter. Obviously, the incredible hard aspect of that exact sentence is, how do you not instill pain in your children? That is a question I do not have the answer to, Brian, but I'm convinced that you have a much better answer than I, and I'm sure you're doing a great job at doing just that.
Well, I always joke with my wife, and like the kids are acting up or something. Get the instruction manual, because I'm like so whatever, left brain. I always forget what brain.
Yes.
But anyway, the point is, and doing that, and really, it's like I feel like innocence is really, underappreciated. It's perhaps the greatest. Most perishable of all resources. People say, time, you can never get back time. You can waste a lot of time. Like, you and I are watching our share of cat videos, please. But innocence is really not only perishable in time, from a young age to the age, like you were telling me, 12 years old. I think you lost your innocence in a certain sense. And that's much more perishable because it's time bound and it's kind of wrapped up in your soul and your spirit. And it is, we believe as Jews, that every person has this opportunity for doing teshuva, which is, loosely translated as repentance, but it's really like being reborn. And I don't mean like praise Jesus. That's fine. People do that. Born again, but you were born again, and it's thanks to science. So I think, that is sort of, we have to be careful because science is not a religion. It's a substitute religion. Talk about nobelism in my book. But the fact is that this curiosity that you have was probably your salvation and your redemption. And I do want to salute you. I always knew I had a tremendous amount of respect for you. I think you're doing an amazing job. I envy you in a certain sense because you're starting so young. You're so bright, so talented, and you have such a good foundation, head on your shoulders. Don't ever lose that courage that you have. Don't ever lose that kind of intensity and fearlessness to take on issues, even if they're not popular, because those are the people that make all the difference. So, Brendan, I want to thank you so much for going into the impossible at the end of your podcast, State of the Universe. Everyone tune into that. Here's Brendan's information, his Twitter handle, the link to the podcast. Subscribe, support him on all those different channels. Brendan, Have a wonderful day. And if you want to sign off from your end, I'll sign off from my end. And I can't wait to get together with you again.
Sounds good, Brian. Yeah, hopefully next time it's in person.
I know, that'd be so awesome.
That would be nice.
I miss Rochester. I don't know if I miss it in January, February, but I do miss New York. I do miss it in the anytime after, kind of May. And I might be up in Cornell in the near future, and I'll certainly swing by and see you in Rochester.
I will say, I will do that in April of 2024. The total solar eclipse will be over Rochester. So.
Oh, that's right. Okay, so you're gonna jack up the real estate on the Airbnb. Yeah. You said you'd love it. All right, brother. Be well. Have a great weekend, and keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah, same to you, Brian. We'll talk.